basically an Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, occur. And that helped give a boost of 10 years of stable policy that allows developers and IPPs who are looking ahead to plan development of renewables have that a 10-year runway to really help develop it. So that's given certainty to the U.S. renewables market, and you will definitely see growth continuing forward. Now they're coming out of post-COVID times, and I'll talk about that in a second. So when you look at the growth of renewables here in the U.S., and in many ways, these are, even though I'm speaking about the U.S., right, there's a lot of what I call kernels of truth that apply to other markets around the world. Like I said, phase one of the growth of renewables was the 70s. We then had a lack of leadership, right? During the 70s here in the U.S., we had the Iran oil crisis, right, where all of a sudden a majority of our oil and gas that was being produced by Iran and others in the Middle East got very limited. And that's why I think sparked the first thoughts about, hey, let's look at domestic renewables as a source of energy that's more reliable and potentially more cost effective. In phase two, what happened in the 1990s, right before the banks and utilities started to adopt renewables, was you had, like I said, this development of IPPs. The most famous one is Enron, which was a gigantic energy company based here in Houston, Texas. And that actually gave birth to a lot of renewables careers. But back then, it was solely focused on traditional forms of energy. And then they started to adopt renewables. Now, they had a big bankruptcy issue, and it was the biggest scandal in the energy sector here in the U.S. when they collapsed later on in the early 2000s. But it really did show that a big energy company could diversify successfully in renewable energy and provide leadership. Now, at the same time, what was happening was Europe was starting to lead on renewable energy, especially Germany. So you had a gentleman named Hermann Scheer, who was a member of the Green Party in the German Bundestag, who put together the first feed-in tariff, which was a policy that helped incentivize development of solar and wind in Germany. Feed-in tariffs have been used globally also as a policy mechanism or a finance mechanism to help incentivize renewables vis-a-vis traditional energy sources. But that really did help, I would say, do a push on renewables in Europe, which then the US, as always, was trying to catch up really quickly to what was developing over in Europe. Now, what happened, I would say, in the early 2000s that really, as I mentioned before, got the utilities and financiers involved and really pushed things forward was, of course, as you all know, we had the financial economic crisis. We had the American Reconstruction Act that was passed under the Obama administration that helped finance and drive more tax equity, and as well as more tax incentives into the renewable energy market, especially solar. So that was the time when many of the big solar companies, especially solar manufacturers of panels, racking systems, inverters, all that really got boosted. Now, as we're entering in, the 2000s, later 2000s, many of you, I would say in Nigeria as well as globally, are starting to see this. We're starting to see mega trends, right? So how can we jump technology phases, right, and start rapid electrification? Jumping from traditional grids, right, to microgrids, to on-site solar generation, right, and really skipping technologies. The best example I can give, I worked on 5 projects in India, and I was there when I saw people jump from having no telephones, no cell phone communications, boom, to all having cell phones. They jumped having regular landlines, right? Because there's just no need to do a master centralized grid like that. They jumped into a distributed form of telecommunications, right? And so on. So I see that happening. We're in a world where I think there's the constant struggle between major utilities and independent power producers trying to figure out, well, are we going to be a decentralized energy grid in the future? Or are we going to be centralized? Or are we going to have a mixture of both, right? So I think that's the debate right now going on, is what works best. And again, there's no one solution, one silver bullet that helps all, right? But I think that's the debate globally now, is what technology we're supposed to develop to allow for this grid of the future. And I think personally, it's going to be decentralized, right? Storage is going to play a major role. We have lithium-ion technologies coming online. We have compressed air. We have old flywheel technologies that still work. But storage is going to really be the game changer. And I think that's what we're seeing here in the US, especially here in Texas. For example, we have had major issues. So Texas is in its own grid called ERCOT. We're not connected to any other state, which is a little bit of the problem. And we, about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, had a freeze where we ran out of energy, and energy collapsed. And of course, the natural gas and coal industry, so it's the fault of renewables, right? There's too much renewables. The wind turbines were frozen, not enough solar being produced, the whole thing. Now, what happened was actually, yeah, the wind turbines froze. I mean, it was just a very cold, non-windy weather pattern. Solar outperformed, which is interesting, but what we lacked was storage. Now, we had, and Shalom and I were talking about this, the weather a couple of minutes ago, but we actually had another kind of freeze come through, just one little 3 days of one come through about a couple of weeks ago. And what saved us from going back to that is that we had developed and implemented 5 gigawatts of storage. So again, that's what saved us. And so I think more and more as we talk about storage and integrating storage into the grid, connecting with smart meters, doing net metering, things like that, I think we're going to be a lot smarter in how we deal with demand response and dispatchability of renewables moving forward. Now, I think phase 5, which is where we're right now in, I would say is this growth of ESG and global policy. And I mentioned just now storage. Another thing that's talked about by everyone, but no one seems to be pushing forward with is hydrogen, right? Hydrogen is the I call it the new sexy, the new exciting technology. But the question is, though, who is doing what in hydrogen, right? And so, and also there's a big debate right now, especially here in the United States, between green hydrogen and what I call the rainbows, the colors of the rainbow hydrogen. There's pink hydrogen, there's black hydrogen, there's gray hydrogen, there's blue hydrogen, there's every kind of hydrogen, right, from non-renewable sources. And so from our perspective, my perspective, right, we want to push for green hydrogen that's produced from wind, from solar, right, so that you have, coupled with storage, 24-hour, 24/7 dispatch of renewables, right? So that's going to play a major role, game changer. And then ESG, right? Environment, social governance. Many of the biggest corporations in the world now, especially the consumers, the retailers, now have mandates, and they're being called out on those mandates to go fully green and sustainable with their practices, right? Myself, we're going to be announcing 2 announcements with Walmart and Microsoft, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. I'm working with them on some of their ESG standards, right, as they apply to dispatchability of renewables, not only for their own power generation needs, but also for low-income communities around their facilities. So with that, let's go over to the people. So that was the kind of a historical overview. I tried to make it a little exciting, not to make it too boring like a lecture in university. But when I interviewed for the book, so taking a step back, it was COVID. I had lost one of my mentors who was in his late 80s, who was the grandfather of bioenergy, of biofuels here in the US. And I thought of putting together an op-ed, right, to pull together something to talk about his legacy and how he helped the biofuels industry with all of his work, especially on policy. And what went from being a small op-ed, for a magazine, turned into a bigger project, because as I was interviewing a lot of CEOs that were his interns when he was younger, they were giving me stories. I'm like, I wish I knew these stories coming into renewable energy, not only from an inspiration point of view, but also from a factual view. What mistakes were made, what strategies were developed that didn't work, right, as people embarked on their careers in renewable energy. And so what went from what I thought would be a one and done weekend, op-ed, turned into a year and a half worth of writing a book about all these journeys that people took. And what was fascinating was I interviewed 100 CEOs. I had one CEO decline an interview because he was selling Tesla stock and said he had been in a quiet moment. And all of them really had a lot of similar characteristics and traits in common. And here are some, I did a word cloud based on my interviews with all 100 of what were some of the more important traits. And as you'll see, it was a combination of things. Many of you, I would say not many of you, all of you exhibit some of these traits, and there's no one or one correct trait or one dominant trait, right? We all have our own mixtures of traits here that makes sense for us as we start our solar careers or advance in our solar careers. And so a lot of it was being the first. A lot of it was being, having grit, being fearless. Also adaptability. This is a constantly changing industry. No matter if you're doing renewables on the utility scale or on a distributed scale, this is this industry is like the Wild West. There's never a dull moment. like I mentioned before, the technologies are constantly advancing. None of us, even with me being in renewables for 20 years, let me go back. Even with me being in renewables 20 years, I'm constantly learning about the technology. It's constantly changing. It's never the same, right? And that's kind of the excitement of this is how are we in concert with new technologies, looking at better ways to finance these projects, looking at better ways to help policymakers understand as a rapidly changing industry, we need rapidly changing policy, right? And really working on that from the grassroots level up. So anyway, I'll leave with this. I won't belabor this too much, but here are some of the traits, right, that I covered in the book, right, and that we're seen as key traits by CEOs who are industry leaders today as instrumental traits and skills that they recommend others have in advancing their career. Here, and this was something that someone asked me the other day as well. Well, Tom, tell me about the perfect, kind of yellow golden road, right? Your pathway to a successful renewables career, a successful career in solar. And the funny part was, and the reason I did this graph in a honeycomb fashion is that it's almost like choose your own adventure. There's no right way. There's no linear path. There's constantly changing paths, right? You have to pivot in your career. There's the ups and downs. And so here are just some of the CEOs that I featured in the book and that I work with day in, day out. And here are, I'll let you, look at this at your leisure, but you'll see there's just different steps you take to advancing your career in renewables. I mean, figuring out your skill sets and how you sell yourself. I'm a natural born marketer. That's why I love marketing. That's my job day in, day out. And at the end of the day, though, my biggest weakness is I can market a corporation, not a problem. Products, not a problem. But when I came to marketing myself, it was tough. It was really tough. It's a humility pill you take, but you're like, I need to market myself, and you need to be shameless. I know that's a trait that Americans have, that we're very loud, very talkative, we're in your face, aggressive, I would say, in business propositions, but you have to also embody that. And that's one of the traits that I listed in the previous slide, persistence. You have to be persistent, and you can't get it. And I know that's easier said than done. And when many of these entrepreneurs started to take the risk, right, there was family risk, there was money risk, right? But they could continue going on. Sorry, I'm advancing too much. My coffee fingers going faster. But you'll see here, one of the biggest pieces of advice I have for any of you, for yourself personally, or if you're an entrepreneur and have your own startup, is build together a portfolio of work product. So what that means is, if I'm pitching myself as an individual, as a marketer, and I'm not going to only hand in my resume or CV to a company or to a potential employer, but I'm going to put together a portfolio of work product. What that means is, 5 samples of public work product that speaks to the skill sets I have. So me as a marketer, for example, I would include a press release that I did publicly, so I can see kind of that I can report about the news and push out corporate information. It'll include an ad that I designed or that I pulled together, or an ad campaign, right? It'll put together an email campaign, which would be another example. Another example might be an op-ed or a letter to the editor, right? Or a blog that I put together. So think about things like that you do, and they don't even have to be renewables related, right? They could be examples of your work product, and that shows you're serious. Any employer, especially American employers, will look at them and go, okay, this person isn't just, waxing eloquences on a resume, right? But they're actually showing that they care, and they're showing us work product, right? So I'd say as an individual, that's very important. As a company, the number one thing I recommend you do is have a slide deck. You need to have a slide deck about your company, the what I call the who, what, when, where, and why of your company. Short and sweet, 10 slides, no more, no less, going into details about what your work is, what your company is doing, what the offerings to the market look like, right? And some of the successes you've had to date, right? So these things are just important. I mean, as a marketer, you want to market yourself, you want to market your company and build that portfolio. Having a mentor is extremely important. And you'd be very surprised, I'll say, in the renewables industry, people are very, very open and generous with their time. What I usually do is I reach out on LinkedIn or elsewhere, and I say, hey, I'd love to have a 15-minute virtual coffee with you, just to learn about where you came from, how you got to where you're going. And that's something that people globally are very welcome to doing, especially in the renewables industry. I have to say it's a very welcoming industry. And it's something I highly recommend. And then as you're doing these coffee chats, one of the best tips I ever got from my first boss in renewables, that I continue to do today, is if I meet somebody new and I have a conversation, I ask them, hey, who are three other people you recommend I talk to, who are either in your line of business or who have somehow impacted your career? And you'll be surprised if you say, just give me three folks. People will introduce you to those three folks. And as you do that, before you know it, you have this Rolodex of contacts that are not only good for your immediate needs, but also for your career in solar and those long-term relationships. Because at the end of the day, the global solar industry is all about long-term relationships. Many of these people have stuck in it for 20, 30, 40 years. So you want to keep your Rolodex active and alive, right? And then I'm going to get to this in a minute. Join different groups. There's a lot of really interesting global groups that have been active, that can provide you resources, background, and can you really introduce you into the global solar industry. And I'll mention a couple. I'll actually have a slide next that will go into that. And then, of course, personally in events, as well as keep learning and networking. Webinars like this that Shalom is doing, the Renew Technologies is doing, definitely encourage you to keep involved in these groups, because not only do you learn, but you also have the opportunity here on this call. All these people, the 34 people that are on this call today, you just met. If you haven't known these people, you just met another 33 other people, right? So it's important to engage in these webinars, and kind of keep track of who's on these, because you might find a future business partner on a call like this. So this is really important to keep active and carve out time for learning. I would say for myself, I personally carve out one webinar a week, if I can, on a new topic or technology. And then what I do is I spend about an hour a week on LinkedIn, making new introductions and reaching out. And a simple message, the number one tip I have is do not just hit connect with somebody on LinkedIn. Guaranteed 60% of people will not accept the LinkedIn connection, because like, who the heck are you, right? So my recommendation is, whenever you connect on LinkedIn, which is the number one tool, by the way, the number one social media tool here in the US and right now globally to connect on solar, right, on solar connections, I recommend you write a sentence or two, just saying, listen, and a couple of you actually on this call have already done this for me, myself, right? They wrote me an email saying, or a chat message saying, hey, saw your background, really interesting, would love to learn more about about renewables, or would love to connect to get some mentorship, get some mentorship on what I'm doing here in Nigeria, right? Or anything like that. One or two sentences, that's all you need. And that will up your probability of getting a connection to 90 to 100%. So highly, highly recommend you do that. And then also, if you see that those individuals that you're connecting with are connected to others in the industry, you can also ask them, hey, can you facilitate a virtual introduction on LinkedIn for me? And that works amazingly well too. And that's how you really grow out your network, especially on LinkedIn, which I highly, highly recommend. The other thing is to join groups on LinkedIn. There's a number of really good groups on LinkedIn. For example, I'm part of this new ESG sustainability group. There's another one called Renewable Energy Experts that I highly recommend. They're global experts on renewable energy. And they post blogs and links to op-eds that are quite interesting. So encourage you to do that. Now here are, and Shalom promised me to share this with you all. Here are, I kind of brainstormed two sets of lists. One are solar energy trends. What are the top groups, from a US perspective, that you should be following, right, on a variety of topics and issues. So SEIA is our Solar Industries Association for the national one for the US. ACOR is the Pan Renewables Association for the US, so across all renewables technologies. More higher level, so think Wall Street banks, think the major electric utility perspectives. ACP is more of I would say the marketing, the big campaign out there on renewables, right, and American Clean Power. So check them out. The Coalition for Community Solar Access is exactly what it refers to. So we have something called community solar here in the US. Now, what is community solar? Community solar, just like it sounds, basically community solar is limited to a 5 megawatt solar project. So very small projects that are locally based, where you usually have 60% of the energy tied to an anchor tenant, meaning it could be bought by Walmart, by Facebook, right, whatever. The remainder 40% is then subscribed to by local communities, right? So residential, normal individuals like you and me, small businesses, churches, you name it. And it's a really smart model. So if you're looking for something that's quite interesting, community solar is a very interesting model, and it's growing rapidly. Just because you only need 5 megawatts, it's not a big project, right? And it's something where more and more these days people are asking for, if you're going to put a solar field right across the street from me, I want to make sure that energy is coming to me, not going to another state, right? Again, it creates jobs locally too, so there's a lot of perks there. But definitely check out, they have a lot of white papers, a lot of resources on community solar and the model there. The other group is the Clean Energy Buyers Association, which is an association of hundreds and hundreds of retailers and others that are buying green energy and what their game plans are. And this will also help you to see kind of, okay, in Nigeria, for example, or elsewhere in Africa, which of these retailers are really pushing hard on renewables deployment. These might be potential off-takers for corporate procurement for energy rates. So take a look there. Smart Electric Power Alliance, just as it sounds, anything EV charging, anything smart meters, demand response systems, anything with the guts of the system are basically covered with SEPA. So highly recommend you take a look there. Edison Electric Institute is our national utility for the utility sector. So take a look there for what the big electric utilities are now saying. You'll see their tune has changed 180 on renewables. So definitely take a look there. Then you have other groups. Canary Media is my favorite for daily intellectual conversations on renewable energy and solar. They are very gifted. I mean, it's the best, I would say it's the best journalistic writing in renewables right now. So definitely, and it's free. And by the way, you can get on distribution lists on all of these. You have to be members for certain things, but for the majority of them, definitely get on the distribution list, especially CEOs and E-Cores. Now, in terms of, here we go, distribution lists and groups, and Shalom will organize a couple of these. So these are groups that I recommend that you participate in. A lot of them are affinity groups. I can no longer call myself, I think, a young professional. Unfortunately, I'm out of the 40 out of 40 bracket. I'm now in the 50-year-old bracket. So I highly recommend, if you're young and you want to participate in a fantastic program on the renewables, becoming a renewable CEO or a leader in the renewables industry, take a look at the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, CLI. There's an application process. They do offer classes virtually, and it's highly recommend this program. Also amazing networking amongst young professionals who eventually will become the CEO titans, right, of the renewable energy industry. So take a look there. There's also groups like RISE that Shalom is part of, right, the Women in Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy. Women in Solar is another women's affinity group for those of you who are women who are wanting to become, titans on that front. Those are two groups I recommend you take a look at. REN 21 is fantastic. I call it the Renewable Energy Mafia. They're made up of leaders, policymakers, others who have advanced renewables over the years, and they put together some very good programming. The other ones, from a geeking perspective, if you're all about analytics and numbers and behind renewables and data, the Global Energy Network Institute is pretty good for that. And then for those of you who are startups who have a great idea, and this is more of an advertising piece for EDP, but there's two programs that are global that any of you can apply for if you have a startup that has a technology that is solving some kind of gap in the market. One of them is EDP Starter, which is a startup program where we have over 700 startups globally compete for a program for, like I said, solving various issues in the market. And that could be anything from distributed storage, which was one of the applicants, Yada Energy. They thought, well, instead of having a big battery pack on the field, let's put smaller battery packs under each solar panel on a roof, right? Which is brilliant. So they were an example of one of the EDP Starter winners. Another one was a machine, right, that goes and cleans, without water, cleans all the solar panels. So it moves on a rack, basically in a kind of on a rail, cleaning solar panels, especially in desert regions. So really cool program. You also get automatically not only a stipend of sorts, but also you get a procurement contract from us if you win. So that's pretty damn cool. Free Electrons is a program run by all the global utilities, electric utilities, looking again for these innovators and technologies. And it's definitely something that if you're looking at utility scale, and that's something you should definitely take a look at. So with that, I'm gonna kind of transition to my last slide. And I know I went all over the place, and of course, I can give you hours of case studies on different CEOs that I interviewed for my book. For example, one of my best stories that I wrote in the book was about the first female venture capitalist who really got things going. Her name was, Nancy Floyd. And people thought she was crazy when she started financing wind in the 1980s, right? But she really persevered. So there's stories like about her. There's stories about the first, the first 8 IPOs, global IPOs on renewables on Wall Street were all orchestrated by a gentleman named John Lear, and many others in the book that I can go into, especially on the distributed solar side. But feel free. That QR code will take you to the book. You can also download a copy of the audiobook that just went live this last October. Feel free to connect. Like I said, send me over a LinkedIn message. I'm happy to connect with you there. And I constantly am posting on different topics in renewables that are interesting. And what I like to do is that I would love to, I do a raffle at the end of these. And I usually ask a question. You can shoot an email. You have 24 hours to shoot me an email. And then we'll do a drawing for 2 individuals who would get a free copy of the audiobook to listen to. So just to answer this question, so who invented the solar cell? The hint is different individuals invented the solar cell versus the solar panel. I know you all are probably going to rush to now try to find the answer quickly. But if you do know, and I'll be looking at who's the first answer, but if you do know the answer, feel free, again, just email me with the answer to my email address, and I'll do a drawing this week, and then I'll notify the 2 winners with a promo code so they can download the audiobook. So with that, I've talked your ears off this Saturday morning, this Saturday afternoon for you, all of you in Africa. So again, it's been a pleasure. Hopefully I've inspired you a little bit. I know I kind of went all over the place, but that's the nature of renewables, right? But I'm happy to answer at any point any of these questions on technology, on policy, on financing, anything like that. Of course, if I don't have the answer, I'm more than happy also to connect you with those experts here in the U.S. industry. So with that, Shalom, hopefully I didn't disappoint you too much. I try to keep awake and keep energized. But again, thanks for this opportunity, and really keep on doing the great work you're doing. I mean, for somebody who's been doing this 20 years, there are struggles. I had to forego salaries at points, and have no salary and work for free. I had to, pitch my heart out, pick up the phone. I call it dialing for dollars to market products, right? You do the hard work, but looking back, I would not change a minute of it. And you will find people in this industry globally that will be lifelong, not only professional colleagues, but also friends. And I think that's the most amazing thing about renewables is you have friends globally. We all believe that we can do better, and together we have to do this together. Because at the end of this day, we have on Earth, and we all should. So with that, and hopefully a little bit of inspiration this Saturday, I'm going to hand it back to you, Shalom. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mr. Doll. I enjoyed the section. I have a lot of key takeaways, but I will just get right into the questions because I see a lot of questions here. So I'm going to read it to you. And okay. So the first one
Jeopardy.
is
This is like Jeopardy. I feel like we have to have some music in the background too,
It's fine. I guess it's everyone wants to know what's the trend, how to read the trends. And as young people, we still have a lot to learn from the renewable energy industry. So these questions I really find them interesting. The first one is from Mr. Israel. He said, looking at storage, do you see flow batteries as a game changer in this industry? And what improvements are needed in terms of energy storage systems?
No, 100%. Flow batteries, we're starting to see them implemented, right? I think, the biggest question right now are the types of batteries, right? The types of ranging from lithium to ion, to oxide ion, to all these different compositions and the chemical compositions. And as you all know, it all goes back to resources and limited resources. And how do we scale battery storage across all forms, right? How do we scale battery storage while being efficient with the amount of resources we have in the world, and also the recycling side of it? I think the biggest advances right now will be made on the recycling of batteries, right? The recycling of renewables. I think that's where the business is, to be honest. It's the supply chains, the ancillary, secondary supply chains that come from development of renewable energy, right? No one has that figured out. I mean, there are about, I would say, 20 companies right now that I know of here in the US that are starting to recycle solar and wind blades, right? But storage not yet so much. So I think that's going to be where the business is. But yes, I would say flow through batteries. Of course, the ranges of charges, right, and the demand response systems that are associated with the batteries, I think, are just as important. So it'll be really interesting to see how storage plays in with demand response technologies, as well as smart meters and other technologies to really help, flatten out the peak. Because right now we have these almost globally, you see these peaks, these ebbs and flows, right, in energy, and that's costly, and also it's unreliable. And I think ultimately that's the biggest thing renewables has going forward is really basically showing, hey, we need to be reliable. It has to provide 24/7 reliable energy no matter what. So yeah, flow through batteries, thumbs up on that. Yeah, and there's a couple of great companies. Take a look, like here in the US. Obviously, everyone talks about Tesla, but I would say there's also key capture energy that is a really cool battery technology, flow through batteries, right? And many others like that. So I'd say key capture comes to mind right away. Like I mentioned, Yada Energy has that distributed, storage, basically flow through batteries under each of the panels, which I think is just a no-brainer. I'm like, how did someone not think of this before, right? So again, an example of, you can think of these great things. I mean, there's still a lot of innovation needed to be done in renewables. So anyway,
Yeah.
harked on that a little too long. Yeah.
No, no, it was perfect because I know that Zeta is also doing a lot of things around recycling of solar panels and into that kind of research, and maybe she's also going to throw some like insights on that when she comes to our section. So thank you so much for that response.
Definitely.
The second question is this: how do you envision the future of renewable energy adoption? And what role do you think it will play in the country's energy mix, especially in Africa? Okay, this is coming from an African perspective.
Correct. So I'll do my best here, right? And I have been to Africa, but unfortunately, it's only been South Africa. So I'm hoping to come back and explore more of Africa in the future. But from my understanding, right, it is this dilemma of it's all cost something, right? The biggest debate we have in the United States right now is transmission build out. Who pays for the lines, right? And I think we're my mom came from an immigrant family. My parents immigrated from Central Europe in the 60s from a communist country, right? And they fled to the US as refugees. And my mom has a saying, why do we as Americans do things the hardest way first and then the easiest way second, right? So why do we have to learn? So I feel like Africa has an opportunity to jump technologies, like I mentioned with the example of India, right? I don't think the central grid is the answer for Africa. I think the answer for Africa right now in many countries, right, especially Nigeria, it's all about distributed generation. Take advantage of the grid that's already there, reinforce that grid, right, and make it distributed in nature, meaning that you have on-site solar, on-site storage, right? I think that's going to be the answer. I think, and that's not only the answer for Africa. I think that's the answer for the majority of the world, right? Where more and more transmission lines, I call it the Thomas Edison method of distributing energy. That transmission strategy, I think, is not the winning one. I think it's going to be all about distributed energy. It's going to be all about storing the energy, right? It's going to be about dispatching it when it's needed, most likely at the source of generation, right? So I think that's the future. I think that's where we're going. I think for Africa that you'd be jumping, some lessons learned. Don't do it the way we did it. Jump over, making gigantic transmission lines across the country, and think about the variety of renewables, right? Not all renewables work everywhere, right? So you have to look at geothermal resources in Africa, look at wind resources, look at solar resources, right? Look at hydrogen development possibility. Really play across all the strengths of renewables, right? But yeah, I think like the no-brainer is solar on roofs. I'm a big believer of every structure should have solar panels on their roofs. I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? The question is financing, and there's a lot of models. My former boss, Mike Eckhart, did something called a solar fund in South Africa, working with the utility down there. So if you look him up, Michael Eckhart Solar Fund, you'll see some of the work he did in Africa on providing community level loans, basically to local businesses who are setting up solar for lighting up solar lighting, in the solar street lights, or lighting up and electrifying schools and other businesses. And it was done in a very interesting way. So it's called Solar Fund. Check it out, Michael Eckhart. You can Google it. Yeah, I'm a big believer of the distributed generation side, even though I should be careful because, of course, in my day-to-day work, I work on the utility scale side too. But yeah, but DG is the way to go, I think. Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's perfect. I've never had it from this perspective, being like being in Africa and hearing Africans talk about the energy transition. It's usually key on like decentralized energy systems rather than like a distributed generation. So that's quite interesting. This is like a question on the part where you were talking about like marketing ourselves. So you made mention of how you were able to market other companies, but like when it comes to yourself, it's like more of like a struggle. So it's like the question is, how do we then market ourselves such that we are not rude and you're
Yeah.
humble, you're keeping the the respect to everybody that you're speaking with, but then you're able to also highlight like personify the your achievements in a way that doesn't sound off rude. Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, no, and listen, believe me, I struggle with it all the time. I'm a talker, so Shalom knows this. I'm a talker. I can talk your ear off, but what for me, it's always been just difficult to market myself, just because I felt like, and we all have what we call imposter syndrome. We all are like, do I really have the authority to talk about this, or am I just making things up, right? And I think at the end of the day, we all have gifts, right, that have been given to us, and these are skill sets, right, that we can play off. And no one on this call should at all feel that they don't have something to offer up. Every single person here has something to offer up for the renewables industry, and I think that's the important thing to remember. And when you market yourself, I think it's about confidence more than being aggressive, right, or coming off as aggressive. It's being confident and saying, I actually have a work product or a business or a service here that will favorably impact renewables, and I really believe in it. I want you to join me in this journey, right? And I think it is the narrative. It's how you describe yourself. It's how you describe your business, or your startup, right, or a concept. And it is, building up that narrative. That's quite important. And that narrative could be about yourself. Again, it could be about your product, but it is when you're thinking about marketing 101, you're offering up a vision of how does my product or solution help you in your day-to-day work. And I think that's the most important thing is, you stand up and go, I actually have something good here that's going to help you. And you just have to be confident in yourself. I know that's a really easy answer, and that might be skirting it a little bit, but that's what's important. And then you have collateral behind you to support you. I'm a big believer of your collateral, your slide deck, your pitch deck. That is 100% representative of your work. And so that's why it's really important to be very pulled together, have your ducks in a row, as we say here in the US, right? And when you do present or send an email to somebody, you have a PDF of a deck saying, here's this, we'll walk you through kind of what I'm thinking through. That's quite important. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's all about confidence. And I also believe in that. It's all about the confidence. Thank you so much for the response. I have three more questions to go.
Okay.
Um,
I just want to be respectful of my next speaker. So I know she's
yeah,
she's waiting to speak. So I just want to be respectful. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, let's just take about let's say 5 minutes to round all the questions, although
Okay.
like these questions are really like from the African perspective. So I have
Okay.
here from a question about Somalia, the other one is about Rwanda, and then the final one is still talking about almost similar things. For Somalia, it's asking, are there any companies that are interested in solar marketing over there? Are you
Mhm.
aware of that for Somalia?
Definitely. So I can point you, so for our colleagues in Somalia and Rwanda, I can point you to a program that we're involved with at work with those countries, right? Working on local solar development. I think for us, it's also a question of microloans and how do you develop loans at the community level to support solar development in Somalia and Rwanda and areas like that. So I can, if we can do this, I can find the link to the program that my colleagues are involved in. So a lot of my colleagues in Europe are actually involved, excuse me, in that program. So I can send that over.
Okay.
You can see the list of other companies like Vestas, like on the wind side, and other companies that are involved there on the renewable side. So definitely can point you in that direction. I would say for us, right, it's been all about accessing markets on both the DG and utility scale side that have had established transmission grids, right? So that's been the barrier, and I think that's where the opportunity is for companies like us to start looking beyond that. That's why I've been very bullish on distributed generation, right, and distributed energy resources. But yeah, I can definitely, what I can do is for those of you who had that question, you can either go through Shalom, or feel free to send me an email on my email address, and I'm happy to answer back with that link to better help.
Okay, I'll send you a message after the section, and once the link is available, I'll be sending it across to everyone that has registered.
Perfect.
The last two questions are just all about the cost of solar energy. How do we
Yeah.
make it cost effective so that people can be able to transition?
Yeah, it's here in the US, we now have the most expensive, we pay the most amount for solar products, right? And that's due to the trade wars, right now going on, especially with China. There's been a lot of tariffs that have been added on to Chinese imports into the United States, which have increased the costs of all of our power purchase agreements, right? So when, as a global company, we get to share numbers, right, of what power purchase agreements look like. And that's primarily our business right now at EDP. 99.9% are power purchase agreements, right, with corporate procurers who come to us saying, listen, we need X amount of energy. What farms can we buy into, right? What solar parks can we buy into? And so that's where it's really tough. I think we have to figure out globally, there's been this globalization effect where, unfortunately, majority of solar technologies are being manufactured in China. Now, is that sustainable moving forward, right? And given the policy climate, right, policy and all these climate wars and trade wars that are happening affect us all at the end of the day. So question is, I think the movement right now is to decentralize. I think the time of China manufacturing everything is to be honestly, it's over. I think what's happening now is you're seeing facilities being set up globally to develop renewable technologies. And the question ultimately is by decentralizing this global supply chain, is there a way for us to lower costs? And also resources. Unfortunately, as you know, and many of you being in Africa are closer to this than I am, it is this race towards resources. The cobalt for storage. There's the ethical implications of how are we extracting these resources, right? How are we being fair labor-wise in extracting these resources, right? So I think there's a lot of questions that will come into play into how pricing of solar proceeds forward, and how do we do it in the most ethical and just way. I think that's going to be the challenge, and there might be an increase in price because it's not going to be a cheap answer, right? But I see, the trend has been over the years, right? If you look at the last 5 to 10 years, the price of solar has gone down by 70%, primarily because of Chinese, centralized manufacturing of solar. And I think right now, when you look at who owns the most amount of crystalline, right, it's China and Norway, right? So I think right now it's the pricing of solar, it's gone up because of tariffs primarily. I think the question now will be the resources question, and how do we set up manufacturing capabilities close to sources where the resources are being extracted. And I think that's a great opportunity for Africa, is in terms of manufacturing and being close to the resources where those resources are being extracted, and also giving back to the community. I'm a big believer of, hey, we all are wanting this clean energy transition, but the minute you leave behind communities that are helping us in this transition, you've lost that campaign, that marketing campaign, right? And that goodwill from the community and the workers that are working about it. So how do we make this a win-win for everybody who's involved, right? Again, I think the best sources for renewables pricing, so solar pricing, if you're looking at kind of the trajectories of solar pricing and forecasting, there's a lot of free resources by Wood Mackenzie. So if you just Google Wood Mackenzie quarterly solar reports, they actually do a quarterly report on solar pricing, and that across the board, right? And that's everything from supply chain pricing all the way up to PPA pricing and what people are paying right now in terms of power purchase agreements. So take a look there. Obviously, the number one standard, though, is Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They have a number of free reports available that also goes through pricing right now. And that could, and anything you're tweaking in terms of proposals, if you're putting together any kind of financing models or financial models for consideration, take a look at those two resources.
Okay. Just going to drop that in the chat box for anyone who is interested to look through that.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Tong. I'm so excited. I'm so happy that I'm glad that you joined us. Thank you so much. I see that we are done with all the questions. And yes, thank you so much once again for joining us.
Not a
And
problem. Thank you. And like I said, you have my contact information on
yes.
that last slide. By all means, please reach out and please know you have a lot of people behind you supporting you in what you're doing. So don't ever be shy. And from this loud American to all of you, just really keep up the great work. And again, thanks for this opportunity. And we're there rooting for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'll send you a message after the call. Thank you so
Perfect.
much. Yes. Uh, thank you everyone for staying with. And Mr. Tom, you can always if you also want to leave, I understand that you have a very busy schedule. So I'll just send you a follow-up message
Oh
after.
no, I'm staying on. I'm excited to
Oh,
hear the next speaker, so I'm staying on.
okay,
Like I
okay.
said, one webinar a week, you learn more. So I'm here to learn. So look forward to it. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So I'm going to go right into introduce our next speaker, a very dear friend, and I'm so glad she accepted this invite. I'm going to read her bio and then call her to take it away. I'll share it right away. Oh, I know. We can see it. We can see the screen, right? Yes, it's on. Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce Miss Zita. Miss Zita is currently a PhD candidate in energy engineering at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Her primary focus lies in the realm of solar energy, where she is engaged in the solar module prototyping and characterization laboratory. In this capacity, she conducts IV testing using cutting-edge technology, specifically the 1.5 solar simulator, which is a flash tester. Her research interest extends to floating photovoltaics, so FPV, solar PV recycling, and I'm so excited and ready to hear about that, and PV reliability. Zita is passionate about the energy transition. She's passionate about climate change and sustainability. She has worked as a research intern at Schneider Electric in Algeria and as a program management intern with the Women for Sustainable Energies and Climate Action, where she is an active member. She also maintains affiliations with organizations such as ANSO, the African Network for Solar Energy, New England Women in Energy Engineering and the Environment, and the Women of Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy. So we are on the same program together. Zita has participated in energy programs, including the Open Africa Power Program by Enel Foundation, the Career Training Program by Student Energy, the Rising Solar Power Fellowship by Rise and Great Alternatives, the Student Energy Fellowship, and the African Fellowship for Young Energy Leaders. Zita's achievements include prestigious awards such as the Pan-African University Scholarship, which supported her Master of Science in Energy Engineering. She also clinched the Energy University competition by Schneider Electric in 2021. She holds a bachelor's degree in electrical and electronics engineering from the University of Bora, Cameroon, and she is deeply passionate about addressing energy-related challenges, particularly in the realms of rural electrification and environmental sustainability. With a warm welcome and a round of emojis, please make welcome Ms. Zita. Zita, you can take it on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shalom, for the introduction, the warm welcome. And I also just want to say thank you very much, Mr. Tom, for the very insightful session. I was closely following and I almost forgot I was also a presenter to today's session. It was just so enriching and I learned a lot. Thank you very much for that. And I have learned a lot from your presentation, and I just want to take out two key points which you mentioned that I believe it's directly linked to my own presentation today. So I have prepared some few slides, and the two things you mentioned are the fact that the renewable energy industry is growing. We have new technologies that are being developed, and also the fact that there is need for storage. And I will just hop in on those 2 points, and I will quickly share my slides. And okay, I'm sharing my slides right now. Can you see my slides, please?
Yep, works perfectly, yep.
Okay, thank you. So today in this brief presentation, I hope I'll be very brief, but I'm going to be presenting and talking to us about floating photovoltaics, which is also one of the very new solar technology out there. Research is still ongoing in the domain. And in addition to this, I'll also be hopping into talking about storage, but storage in this case linked to the floating photovoltaics. And we're going to, I hope by the end of this presentation, understand a lot more about this technology and the potential that exists out there, especially maybe for African countries. Okay, this is just how brief the presentation is going to look like. As I said, we will talk about the floating photovoltaics. We will talk about its hybridization with the hydropower systems, and we will look at some of the advantages and disadvantages and research gaps for consideration. I understand that we are youth in here, and we also have occurring research. Some of us are master's students, PhD students. We may be wondering what's my thesis topic and all of that. I just hope that these research gaps could help to direct someone here to grab a thesis topic or something of interest to work on. So when we talk about photovoltaics, what is this? What are floating voltaics? So we FPV, I would just call it FPV for short. It is the installation of floating solar PV, like installation of solar panels on water. This is a very new technology. So the solar panels are installed on floating structures on water. It could be pontoon, which is one of the most common floating structure on which they are installed on. And this pontoon is made out of polyethylene. And there are other structures on which you could install these solar panels. So you either install them on the pontoon or you install them on glass fiber reinforced plastics. And so the main aim of this is to help the floating structures, help the panels to float on water. And they are attached also either to the bottom of the water on which you're installing the floating panels, or they are attached to the shores. So you might be wondering, you can install these floating panels on any water around. You could also have you have lakes around, you could have rivers around, you have hydropower systems where the floating solar PV is being installed. You also have canals. You could install that on canals. You can install that on water treatment storage systems and so many other things. And as I earlier mentioned, floating PV is a very new technology, and the first commercialized FPV was installed in California in the USA in 2007. It was about 175 kilowatts. That was when the very first floating PV was installed. And right now we have very much larger installations which exist out there. And the biggest being in China of about 320 megawatts capacity. And despite the fact that it is a very new technology, there have been there have been a noticeable increase in the installation of these floating PV systems. And in 2014, for example, the capacity was just about 10 megawatts P. And right now we are talking about more than 2.6 gigawatt P installations worldwide. And according to Dale, the forecast by Dale shows that installations are going to increase. And by 2025, we'll have almost 13 gigawatt P, which is huge, okay? And yeah, an advantage too of this is that the solar panels cost is decreasing, and therefore this is a very exciting field to venture into and a very new technology, exciting with a lot of advantages. So how then does this floating PV system work? So I hope we all understand the technology behind solar panels on its own. It works the same. The photovoltaic principle, it works the same in this case where sunlight hits the solar panels and it's converted to electricity. And the only difference is where these systems are being installed. One of the challenges to the current installation being land-based is the fact that there is limited land, mostly in African countries. And also there is there is a fight with land, okay, and a lot of people are beginning with land. We need land for farming, especially in Africa, where I think about 70% of the people are farmers. And so this technology helps to save land, okay? And so this is how it looks like. This system was designed using SketchUp. So we see the solar panels installed on water, and we see the mooring lines and the anchoring units that hold the solar panels to the bottom of the water. So in this case, the anchoring is made to exist at the bottom of the water, whatever water you're installing the solar panels on. And birds, you can also have the mooring unit attached to the shores. You can also attach the mooring unit to the shores of the solar of the water body. And so the energy generated from these solar panels is sent to a central inverter. We understand that energy generated from the panels is direct, is in DC. So the inverter then converts the DCs to AC, to alternating current, which is then sent to the transmission line and then distributed for use. So here I have just named some of the components of the systems and the functions. We have the pontoon, which I earlier mentioned. The pontoon in this case is this white structure here, which helps the solar panels to float on water. There are different types of floating structures, which we are going to see in the course of this presentation as well. Then we have the mooring and the anchoring system that helps the solar system to be fixed on the water body. So you don't just put them and leave them there, but you also need to have some anchoring systems in case of high wind speed and so on. The floating structure shouldn't be moving all throughout the water body. We have the PV modules, which helps to generate the electricity. We have the combiner box. Here is the combiner box. The energy generated from all the PV modules is sent to the combiner box and then to the central inverter. We have the transformers. The transformer just helps to step up the AC voltage generated to the transmission for transmission. And then we have the cables that helps in the distribution of the energy. So this is the very basic and understandable structure of the floating solar PV. So as I earlier mentioned, I want us to look at the various mounting configurations for floating solar PV. The very first one here, which is the pure float configuration. This one has both the primary and the secondary float, okay? The primary float is mainly used to attach the solar panels, and the secondary float, which you see on the image here, helps to access the floating structure on water. So in cases of maintenance, the engineers and the technicians need access to do maintenance. So they work on the secondary float, and the primary float is on, we have the solar panels installed on there. So that is the pure float configuration. It is the most common configuration of floating PV structures. Then we have the modular raft configuration. This one is much more simpler than the pure float. In this case, we just have metals that are attached to floats. And this is also very basic and could be designed locally. But the challenge with this modular raft configuration is the fact that it is difficult to assess the floating PV structure whenever you design it. Okay, it is much more challenging than the pure float configuration. And now we have the membrane mats configuration. An example of this configuration exists in Norway. We have the membrane that is installed on water, then the floating solar, the PV panels are installed directly on the membrane. And this also has advantages, but one of the disadvantages of this structure is that it is difficult to, if maybe after doing installation of say 1 kilowatt system and you want to upgrade, you want to enlarge your system, it is difficult to do that with the membrane and mats configuration. So these are the basic configurations that exist out there for the floating PV system. And I just wanted to show you an example of the floating PV system. Here is a setup in west south of Boston in the USA. And it is one of the facilities where we are carrying a project on this and doing some testing and collecting data from this system. So in this case, you see the floating system installed on water. And if you look in there, you will see that the water is a little bit frozen. Okay, and yeah, so this is the floating structure. And the next image, I just wanted to show a closer look of how it looks like. We have the, as I earlier mentioned, this is the pure float configuration that was used here. We have the solar panels installed on the primary float structure, and then we have the secondary float structure, which is used to access the floating PV system for maintenance and other issues. Okay, so now this is also a very important aspect of the floating PV, which we need to take into consideration. For anyone who wants to, any company who wants to install floating PV out there, you need to do an environmental and site assessment. Okay, you don't just install the floating PV on any water body, but it is also very important that you do an environmental assessment of the water body to see if that is fit for FPV installations. And one of the things you need to assess is the wind speed of the particular location. And it is recommended that the wind speed should be less than 30 meters per second. The wind speed, you need to assess the wind speed of the location, the wave height of the water body. You need to know how high it goes, because the floating PV, that would determine how you would design your mooring units and your anchoring units, if they should be flexible enough to allow the floating PV movement on the water body. Then the water current, the direction of the velocity, you need to assess that. You need to assess the snow and the ice accretion. And this is one of the things we are currently working on. We are assessing the ice thickness, the growth of ice, and the variation in ice thickness of various water bodies here in Northeast England. So here in England, so we are assessing all of that to make sure, because it is also very important that you know your ice thickness and ice formation. In cases like in the winter, for example, where the water body is completely frozen, how will your solar PV behave? Okay, so that's also one very important factor. You also need to assess the fouling potential of the system. You assess the solar irradiance. Of course, this is also very important for wherever you're installing your floating PV. You need to know the irradiance of that particular location, the temperature, the humidity and salinity of the water body, because the floating solar PV systems could be corroded depending on how on the salinity of the water body and how humid that is. And you also need to know the water composition, and that is from a chemical and biological perspective, and the neighboring activities there. Neighboring activities, why? One of the things we realized when we went to our floating PV project was that we realized some stones on the installation. That means that maybe the neighboring people had to throw some stones on the solar panels. So you need to understand the neighboring activities of that particular location, the water pollution, the water visibility. You need to know what the water body is used for. There are different water bodies which could be used for drinking, for example, okay? And so you need to be able to assess that to know what the water body is used for, the depth and the bathymetry of the water body, the level, the water level, and the ground conditions and earthquakes. Ground conditions, particularly for the mooring and the anchoring of the floating PV systems. So these particular factors are very important that you assess and make sure these conditions are fit for the installation of the floating PV on whichever water body you want to install that on. And now, then here comes the aspect of storage. Our previous speaker, Mr. Tom, talked about the need for storage. And so in this presentation, I just want to help us understand the role of hydropower systems as storage to the increased installation of renewable technologies. We have the image where the floating PV systems install on hydropower systems, and this helps in terms of storage, and both systems work in parallel to help each overcome the challenges of the other ones. So in the next slides, we'll be talking more about the hybridization of these systems and in which condition these systems are effective, how the potential that we have in Africa. So we have the in-river, on-river installation of the floating PV systems. And so in the on-river installation, there is little or no storage. In this case, you just install your floating PV systems on a flowing river, okay? And so the water could be used for the generation for generation as a hydropower system, and then you also have your floating solar PV installed on the water body, which is an advantage. So in this case, in terms of when there is high irradiance, for example, your solar PV systems generates the electricity that is used for distribution and consumption. And then when the irradiance is low, you could have the hydropower system coming to be used, okay? And now we have the dam hydropower systems. In this case now, the floating PV system is installed on the dam, okay, on the storage of the hydropower system. And also they work in parallel. When there is high irradiance, you have the solar PV system generating electricity. And when there is no irradiance, you have the hydropower systems generate. And in this case, the advantage of this system is that the installation of the floating PV on the hydropower system dam helps to prevent the evaporation of water. In Africa, for example, where we have a lot of water evaporation from the dams. In countries, for example, I will talk of Cameroon. 70% of the energy generated from Cameroon comes from hydropower, about 70%. So during the dry seasons, we face a lot of challenges with energy. Like with electricity, we have constant blackouts because you hear complaints from the national electricity company, like the water has been evaporated, there's limited water from the hydropower systems and all of that. So installing floating PV on the hydro dams will also help minimize the evaporation from these water bodies. Then we have installing the floating PV on pump hydro systems. Now, pump hydro systems is a kind of technology where you have two storage. You have one at a lower height and one at a higher height, okay, of a hydropower system. And so the importance of installing the floating PV on such systems is that during moments of irradiance, water can be pumped from the lower storage to the higher storage of the hydropower system and stored there. And so when there is a higher need of energy, the water that is stored in the higher storage, it's then used to generate electricity. So this is how the hydropower systems come in as storage in the case of FPV hybridization, okay? So that is and hydropower system, the capacity for hydropower system, especially pump hydro, it's huge worldwide. And so this could be a very important this could be a good potential for storage for the renewable energy system, especially in regions where they have the hydropower capacity. We have mostly in Central Africa as well, we have huge capacity for hydropower, and so we could benefit from this to expand our renewable energy installations. So I think I already mentioned about the two main scenarios, functioning principles of the hydropower and hybridization with the floating PV systems, where in the case of high irradiance and low energy demand, for example, you have the solar PV systems generating electricity, and the excess from it is used to say, for example, in pump hydro systems, store water in the hydropower system facility. And in the cases of low irradiance, because with low irradiance, it means the output from the solar energy system is going to be low. Then we now have the hydropower use the water that was stored to generate electricity and distribute that, and which would be distributed for use. So these are the main scenarios and the advantages of hybridization of such systems. And now I just want to talk about the potential of the hydropower systems, these hybridized systems. And I just started by giving the capacity of hydropower systems that exist worldwide. We have the runoff rivers, we have the hydro reservoirs and the pump hydros. We have the runoff rivers, we have about 328 gigawatts capacity of such systems worldwide. For the hydro reservoirs, we have 701 gigawatts, and for the pump hydro, about 141. So this capacities, if made use of for the installation of floating PV, would indeed be very beneficial to also help reduce the level of increase energy access, to also help increase energy access to most communities. And now these hydropowers, of course, could be used as storage. It has about 96% power storage capacity and 99% energy storage. So this is the potential for hydropower. And if hybridized, for example, this is just a literature of the potential of FPV and hydropower systems which exist out there. I won't go into the detail of this, but I would just take, for example, the analysis made by the very first researcher, Fafang, and in his research, for example, they analyzed the worldwide hydropower reservoirs and see, for example, if we take the worldwide hydropower reservoirs and install for, say, 25%, occupy 25% of this surface area of these reservoirs and install floating PV and install PV panels on that, then we will have about 440 gigawatts potential. And that is for hydropower reservoirs. And if we talk about all the hydropower facilities, they will have about 570 gigawatt potential. And in terms of electricity, we have 6,270 terawatts hour. And it's going to save a lot of water. For example, about 74 billion meter cube of water would be saved every year from evaporating on these hydropower facilities. And so this is just an analysis of the potential that exists out there for the hydropower systems. Okay, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these systems. Let's start with the advantages of such systems. For example, it saves land. Yes, of course, the hydropower, the floating PV is installed in water rather than land. So we could use land for other activities. And also the installation of these panels on water helps to cool the solar panels. Solar panels at higher temperature have a lower output. As the temperature increases, the output from the solar panels decreases. And so when we have the installation of these panels on water, so it helps to cool the solar panels and therefore increases the use and the generation from the solar panels. And they also have reduced grid costs. Reduced grid costs in the case where if we hybridize these floating PV systems with hydropower systems already have an existing grid. So in this case, you would be using the existing grid of the hydropower systems for the transmission of your energy, and therefore the cost reduction in the installation of new grids components. And we also have flexibility because the hydropower can compensate for the variability, PV variability, and likewise. And also we have limited evaporation of water from the hydropower systems in case of hybridization, and limited algae growth also because the floating PV installed on water blocks limits the amount of sunlight penetrating to the bottom of the water and therefore limits algae growth. And the general output from such system increases in the case of hybridization. So those are some of the advantages of this floating PV system. Now, talking about the disadvantage is the first one, of course, which is the main challenge for most PV installations, is higher initial cost. So the upfront cost of such system is high, and also geographically restricted. It is difficult to assess to find the appropriate water bodies on which the floating PV could be installed. That is another challenge. And also the uncertainty about maintenance costs. This particular research, floating PV is a new technology, and there is not a lot of information out there regarding the maintenance costs. And so that is also a disadvantage. And also there is uncertainty about the degradation of the materials. The installation of floating PV on water, is it going to have, say, its lifetime, is it going to be extended just like the land-based PV installations? There is uncertainty and there is no clear information about such installations out there. And also the equipment transportation and installation is difficult. Floating PV, for example, is designed close to the shores and push on the surface of the water. So they don't perform the installation on water directly. You do the installation on the shores, and then the system is pushed on the surface of water. So if you don't have enough space at the shores for the water body to do the installation, that's a challenge. And also transporting the floats to the water bodies is also costly. So those are some of the disadvantages. And so these are some of the areas where you have limited research about this floated PV system. And so if you are, say, a master's student or a student and are interested in the floating PV industry, these are some of the areas you may want to consider. The weather conditions, for example, you may want to assess the weather conditions of the specific installation location, the wind speed, accessibility of that area, the ground conditions, and the purpose of the reservoir. I think that I already mentioned the first 3 points. I just want to talk more on the purpose of the reservoirs in the case of hybridized system. Purpose of the reservoir in the sense that in most African countries, reservoirs are used for base loads. Most reservoirs are used for base loads, like as I mentioned in Cameroon, for example, about 70% of the energy generation comes from hydropower systems. So you may want to understand the use of these hydropower systems before you could install a floating PV system on those. Okay, it is very important to understand that, such that you also understand the need for the market and the changes in the market structure. Now, these are some of other areas of the research gaps. Waving and mismatch effects of this floating PV system. What I mean by that is that when you install the solar panels on water and maybe say there is wind blowing, the changes in the waves of the water also causes the solar panels to move, okay, to move in a wavy form. And so by moving in a wavy form, the solar panels are individually hit differently by the solar radiations. And so the generation from one cell can be different from another cell. And so the mismatch effect, which could potentially reduce the overall generation from these solar panels. So that is an area of research that has not yet been delved into keenly. So that is a potential aspect to look into. Voltage variations and frequency variations in the cases where the floating PV system is connected to the grid. There is limited research about that aspect. The financial cost of upgrading the capacity of electrical components. Also, I may mention the fact that installing hybridizing floating PV and hydropower systems is advantageous in the sense that the floating PV systems makes use of the already existing grid for the hydropower. But then you may want to understand in cases where there is need for upgrade of the various electrical components, say the transformers on the transmission line, on the grid, what are the specific things that are supposed to be done? So there is need to assess that as well. The modeling of the electrical output, be it on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis. The geotechnical studies for anchoring. Anchoring is very important for the installation of the floating PV system. So understanding the anchoring, the geotechnical studies, the need for anchoring and the specific locations where conditions for anchoring is very important. That's an area that hasn't been delved into also. And the components degradation and the choice of components. Floating PV right now, the solar panel, we know you have different technologies of solar panels. We have the first generation, which is the silicon base. We have the thin film, and we have the third generations, which talk about the new technologies like organic PV and perovskite solar cells. So mainly the first generation, which is the silicon base panels, are used for these floating PV installations. But also you want to assess the choice of components for, say, the combiner box and the central inverters in case you need to install them on water. What will be the effect on water on such electrical components? That is another area of research that has to be analyzed. the transmission of energy from this floating PV system. Do you want to transmit it submarine, like below water, or do you want to transmit it on water? It also has to be analyzed, and the topography of the water bodies. By analyzing these things, for example, you may give recommendations, like recommended practices for the installation of floating PV system. And those are areas of research. As I said, the floating PV system is a very new sector. It's still new, and there is quite improvement that is going on in these specific industries. And so a lot hasn't been researched. There is limited information about these aspects right there. And the behavior of the system at different time scales, on an hourly base, on a daily base, yearly base, monthly base. There is another aspect of research that is has limited information. The detailed studies of the effect of water bodies. For example, there are facilities that there are water bodies which the owners of some water bodies won't accept that the floating PV be installed on these, because they believe that there is degradation from the installations and therefore polluting the water bodies. For example, if the water bodies is used, say, for drinking and all of that, that will be an issue, right? So there is limited information, detailed information about the effects of installing these floating PV on water bodies. And that is another potential aspect for research, and the benefits of these systems at sub-hourly level. Analysis of the systems with electrical markets in view. So these are the research gaps which I could come across that exists out there for floating PV systems. And I just want to conclude by saying that, of course, the floating PV system is a very new area for research, and there is still a lot of gaps in terms of the system in general. And as I earlier mentioned, it's a promising technology that would be used to overcome some of the challenges faced by the land PV installations. Just like we have limited land issues, so by installing floating PV on water, we would be able to overcome the challenges faced with land. And so the research gaps that exist out there, if they are vividly addressed in the next future, then there will be a lot more of such floating PV installations, and the potential would increase. So there is potential, and we just need to make use of such installations. I hope that we've been able to learn a little bit, if not about the floating PV installations and the capacities and the advantages and disadvantages. And yeah, thank you for your keen attention. Shalom, over to you.
Okay. Wow. Such an interesting conversation. Oh my God. I seem to have lost I seem to have lost access to some of the questions. Wow, this is amazing. Okay, Mr. Jonathan, are you still there? Can you read out the first question for me? While he's going to be grabbing that, I hope you can still all hear me.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. Take a hold of some of the questions, right? Or I think Farah did ask a question regarding how sustainable it is. Yes, Farah, do you mind please asking the question again, because we don't seem to, I think we're running through some technical issues. Yes, we can hear you.
My question is, speaking of the efficiency of the floating PVs, like she was talking about in the UK, where the water bodies normally turn to ice. So what's the efficiency of the floating PVs during winter season?
Okay. During the winter season, for example, the output from the floating PV obviously would decrease compared to other seasons. And also from the image that one of the images during the presentation, you realize that the water body is frozen. And so one of the common things in winter here is that you have snow falling on the panels, which also limits the amount of irradiation getting to the floating PV structure. And also some panels could be frozen in water. I watched a video. Okay, unfortunately, I couldn't share the video here because it belongs to company property. I watched a video where in the winter, the floating PV structure was frozen beneath the water. So you have snow falling on the floating PV structure. And so the weight of the snow caused the floating PV structure to go beneath the water. And unfortunately, before it could come back out of the water, because of the condition of the winter, they got frozen beneath the water. Such systems, the output from such systems reduced drastically, of this FPV system reduced drastically because the solar panels obviously are getting limited snow and limited irradiation, and with the effect of the mismatch effect from the FPV systems where you have some solar panels exposed to sun and some hidden beneath the water, and so they get different irradiances, and so the general output from the system is being reduced. So the efficiency in that case, the efficiency of the panel, of course, remains, but the overall generation from the system is reduced in cases of limited sunlight and lower generation. And so in such cases now, you will have an effect on the lifespan of such systems. Constantly freezing, they say if you have cable connections that connect the floating PV systems, right? Like the combiner box and all of that. Constantly freezing, if such freezes occur constantly, and over time you will realize that there is a potential that the lifespan of such systems will be reduced. So that will be the disadvantage. And so the efficiency overall is also reduced. Yeah, I hope. Yeah, I hope I answered the questions.
Thank you.
Clear. I think it's a little bit clear. Okay, Zita, thank you so much for that. There's a question from Andrade Kana. No, is it TAR 34? He says are unique to floating PV. Also, what methods are used for diagnosis and maintenance of these FPVs? Did you get the question?
No, sorry, I couldn't.
Okay. And he said, I would like to know the types of faults that are unique to FPV. Also, what methods are used for diagnosis and maintenance of these FPVs?
You would like to know the types of. I heard
faults. I think it's trying to refer to the types of faults that on PV systems and what's the method of diagnostics for such kinds of faults.
Okay, the types of faults.
Yeah, faults.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, the types of faults. I understand the types of fault and the kind of how do you diagnose such faults. So for FPV systems, depending on the season, for example, as I mentioned, there are different types of faults. Could be you have electrical faults, you have mechanical faults, and one of the things which, if you realize during the presentation was mentioned, is that you need to assess the specific location of the installation and what are the current activities that exist there. That could be one of the ways to avoid the mechanical faults or maybe the environmental faults that could caused by the local people around or the people living in that sector. Because if you have people throwing things on the water bodies, if you have people throwing dirt or throwing things on the water body, that could also impair the functionality of the floating PV system. So another one could be electrical faults. Already we are aware that electricity and water, having electrical components, it is challenging for electrical components to work, function appropriately on water. So you see most of these installations, for a case, for example, the central inverter, you either install the central inverter on a floating structure pontoon on the lake, or you install that on the shore. And so these systems have to be isolated from the water to avoid some electrical faults that could occur. So another one could be electrical fault because of the installation, say, of the central inverter on the water bodies. And so assessing these electrical faults could be, most of these FPV installations are being monitored. Okay, you have they are being monitored, and so once it is realized that the output from the systems is drastically low, or maybe the output is it's reduced somehow, then the technicians are sent on site. They could analyze the central inverter, they could analyze the mismatch effect, and also the effects of shading, which is also very important. Another fault which could be what could happen is if the floating PV installation is shaded. So installing the floating PV, you just have to make sure that there is no shading that occurs around the structure. So those are some of the faults which could occur on the normal floating PV systems. And in the cases of the installation being in the western regions where you have the winter season and so on, as earlier mentioned in the case of the floating PV system being frozen beneath water. From the video I watched, luckily it didn't affect any of the components of the system, but then there is uncertainty about what will happen if such freezing occurs, say, on a yearly basis on that FPV system. Okay, so it could lead to the malfunctioning of the floats, for example, and also of the solar PV, of the solar panels. And so those are some of the potential faults that could occur with such systems.
Oh, thank you so much. I think I had another question that I asked, and I think I was very curious about the setting of how the energy is being sent into the grid. So I understand that the hydropower systems are already existing, and then you have to add the floating PV technologies on it. So I was wondering, how do you do the connection to the grid? And what if like there's high irradiance like from the solar PV systems, and then there's like turbulence on the hydropower side? What happens to the grid at that particular point in time?
Okay, that is a very important question. And yeah, it's very interesting as well. Installing the hybridization of floating PV systems with the grid structure, okay, there is need for a lot of assessment before you could do this hybridization. One of the things which I mentioned where there is limited research is if there is need to upgrade the various grid components, such as the transformers and so on. But just like how the land installations on land are being connected to the grid, you have, after the energy is generated from the floating PV system, you have the central inverter, you have the transformer. And so one of the ways to connect this to the grid is through metering. And so that is the reason why you also need to assess the frequency and the voltage variations, because it is also very important for connecting such systems to the grid. You need to assess the frequency and the voltage variations of your total generation from the floating PV structure. And that has to be in concurrence with that of the grid before you could connect that to the grid, just like the land-based installations are being connected to the grid. So there is need to do those assessments such that the grid should not be underutilized, or the grid should not be, we shouldn't have the issues of curtailment from the FPV installation. Curtailment in the sense that you have the solar PV generating electricity, but it's not being used. So there is a need of a lot of assessment from that, and such that the system could be designed appropriately to avoid all of that.
Oh, that's really impressive. That's very impressive. I think Mr. Tammy asked a question too, but while we are getting to Mr. Tammy, Mr. Tammy, if you can still pull up your question for us, we would love to ask our facilitator. And then I have a question here from Mr. Victor. He said, what material is recommended to be used for FPVs? Or is it that any material can be used?
In terms of the panels themselves, I will start with the panels themselves. We showed the components of the various systems, and though I may not have detailed information right now about, say, the central inverter, which one is specific, but you have for the panels themselves, it is recommended to use most installations use the first generation PV. You have the silicon-based PV, and because of the structure and the third generation PVs, for example, the organic and perovskites are very susceptible to water and all of that. Perovskites are still maybe even under commercialization. Research is still ongoing in that aspect for commercialization. And the organic PV as well, they are very susceptible to water and compared to the first generation PV. So you find most installations using the first generation solar panels for their installation. Informations about you have different float structures that you can use. I don't think, depending on, say, the cost, you could maybe want to assess the cost of the floating structure to be used and the specific location of the installation. You can decide to use either the pure float configuration or the mat configuration and so on. That I don't think there is an issue with using any of them, though they all have their advantages and disadvantages. And for the inverters, for the central inverters, I do not have information about which specific inverter to use. But one thing is that if you're installing your inverter on floating structures on the surface of water, then you have to improve on the insulation, of such systems, because they will be installed on the water body. But inverters as well could be installed on the shore. The only challenge is that you will need a longer cable, right, to transmit the energy generated from the PV on water to the central inverter, which is an additional cost. Yeah, so that's, I think, what I can say about that.
Yeah, Mr. Jonathan, I know there are a couple of questions at your own end. Please, you can ask.
I can.
Okay, Mr. Tam.
Okay, my name is Tammy. The question I put in there initially was just that the networks went off and I couldn't retrieve the question again. But it was all about what would be the impact, because we are talking about the floating system installing it on pond. What would be the impact of the floating system and the other one that is possibly installed on the roof and some other places in terms of current generation or power generation? What would be the impact? Is there any advantage or disadvantage that we have on that very one we talk about, and the recent one, the current idea we're talking about, and the one that we normally used before? That's my first question. And the second question is all about, I heard you talking about preparing it at the shore, then push it to the water. How did you anchor that in terms of preventing it from the current of the water? If it is the water that flows, how did you station it or prevent it from being moved away? Because I also remember you said it should be the base should be at the bottom of the water, if I'm not mistaken, at the bottom of the water. So what will you do? Well, after preparing it and push it to the shore of the water, how did you anchor it so that it won't go again, so that it can withstand the current of the water? I don't know whether that question is clear.
Yeah, I understand the question. So I would start by the first question. You asking to know what are the advantages of the FPV system over the land-based installations that we already have. Is that, if I got your question right?
Very correct.
One thing I will start by saying that each technology comes in to fill a gap. Though there may be a direct comparison between such systems, each technology also comes in to fill a gap as to where the installation is going to take place. We also have, for example, built-in floating built-in solar panels, for example, like building integrated, you have panels installed on, say, on the windows of buildings. That is another technology, right? And so that once fits a specific use. So floating PV installations, when you're comparing it to land-based installation, the advantage is that you don't need land in order to install the floating PV. And so you are already overcoming the challenge faced by land. And so by installing the floating PV on the water, you don't have to be worried about land space for the installation of the floating PV. I think that is one of the challenge, that's one of the advantage. Another advantage is that solar panels, the functionality of solar panels, the output from the installation decreases when there is increased temperature, environmental temperature. So by installing the floating PV on water, research shows that there is a 5 to 10% increase in the overall generation of the floating PV installations compared to land-based installations because of the cooling effects that the water has on the solar panels. That is another advantage. At the end of the day, you cannot deny the fact that land-based installation is also still advantageous because you won't find water bodies in every community. FPV installations are good where you find water bodies located, and so that's an advantage, but you won't always find water bodies in every community and in every country. And in that case now, you still need to have a land-based or rooftop installation. I think I hope the first question was addressed. And the second question about how do you anchor the system? The design of the FPV system is done, the installation is done on the shore and not on water itself and pushed to the lake. I would soon share a link in the chat about an example of such installations, say maybe a short YouTube video. But then before pushing the installation on the water body, they already have anchors to the installations on, say, the foresight. The installation which I presented here about the project we are currently doing research on, it has anchors on the four ends of the installations. And in this case, our anchoring is done on the shore. So in the cases where the anchor has to be done on the bottom, in the bottom of the water body, the anchoring system is already installed before the PV system is pushed in there. And you already have the anchoring, the mooring unit attached to the floating PV system, such that once you push them in there, you just have to connect the mooring units to the anchoring unit at the bottom of the lake. So that is already done before you have the FPV installation put. The help of the anchoring system is just that in cases of high wind, in cases of runoff rivers, for example, you don't have the floating PV moving all over. They are maintained at a fixed position on the water body. So I hope the second question was addressed as well.
Yeah, very well. But the main thing, the first question also talks about voltage and current. And so I just want to know if there is any advantage over the PFV system in terms of voltage generation or current generation.
Okay, so I would maybe address that by saying if you have a 1 kilowatt land-based installation and you have another 1 kilowatt floating PV installation, you want to know it in terms of output, current output. The floating PV installation, research has shown that the floating PV installation will have a higher current generation compared to the land-based installation. If you say you're comparing 1 kilowatts of floating PV installation to 1 kilowatt of land-based installation, that comes as a result of the temperature challenge in terms of the current generation, because the installation on the water, because the floating PV is installed on water, the water helps to cool the floating PV. It cools the panels. And so the generation increases. So if you want to do this direct comparison, neglecting any other factor, then the floating PV installation has 5 to 10% increase in the current generation compared to the land base.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wow, that's excellent. That's so perfect. I think I saw your hand, but it seems that the hand had dropped. I also saw another question about the
Yes,
mismatch
that was
effect.
my hand.
Oh, okay. Andre, okay.
Yes. Madam about the mismatch effect. I just wanted to know what it was about.
Okay.
And my second question was about solar tracking systems. So it was about if we can install a solar tracking system as a FPV, and what will be the repercussions, like the efficiency, the advantage of doing so, or the disadvantage?
Okay, I think I heard both questions. The first question, she's talking about the
Yeah.
mismatch effect.
Mismatch. Exactly.
Mismatch effect. Okay, you see on land-based installations, say if you take, for example, fixed tilt installations, the solar panels are installed, there is no change in the tilt and the azimuth and all of that. And so the solar irradiance is hitting the solar panels. All of them are facing the same direction. And so the incidence rays on the solar panels is hitting all of the panels, individual panels, the same, at the same incidence angle, okay, at the same angle of incidence. And so those systems, the only thing that could affect the functioning of such system is, for example, if there is shading where one panel will receive more insolation than the other. That would be a challenge, but neglecting the shading, if you have an installation, a fixed tilt installation, then you have irradiance hitting all the land-based PV installations at the same time. Now, for the floating PV system, the floating PV systems are anchored either on in the bottom of the water or on the shores. And one of the things which I mentioned, which needs to be assessed, is the water current and the wind speed of that water body on which you want to install the floating PV. So in cases of high wind speed or the wave current is high, you have the floating PV installed on water. So you will have the panels waving, especially if the anchoring is loose, you have the panel waving, right? So normally the panels are supposed to be like this. For example, they're supposed to be like this, the same tip. And if they are waving, you will have one panel facing like this, the other one facing like this at some point. And if both panels are connected in series, you realize that the total output from the system will drop because one of the panels will be at a different angle. And so the irradiance hitting the panels will be lower than the other one. And so the total output from the system will drop. That is the mismatch effect we are talking about. So you have the panels constantly in a wavy structure in the case of high wave currents or high wind speed. And so that affects the total output of the system. Yes, I know her, she's an electrical engineer, so she knows that if a system is connected, I'm saying she's an electrical engineer, for systems connected in series, the total output will be that of the smallest, especially in the FPV generation, okay, in the solar system generation. So if you have panels connected in series, the one receiving the minimum installation would overcome the output of the system, I should put it that way. So that's what the mismatch effect does on the installation. I hope that was clear. And the next question was about, please, can you
That was
remind me?
clear.
The metering.
The second question was about the solar tracking system installed
Yeah.
on water, like an FPV, the advantages, disadvantages, and the efficiency we have compared to the FPV itself.
Yes, just like the land-based PV installations, there is also tracking. You could also install tracking on the FPV installation. You either have a single axis tracker or a double axis tracker, it depends. But then installing the choice for tracking would depend on the choice of your configuration, your floating configuration. Remember, we talked about 3 types of floating configurations. You have the mat configuration, you have the pure float configuration, and so on. For example, if you take the mat configuration, you realize that for the mat configuration, you could only have a single axis tracker in the case where the system would just be rotating like that, and you be limited. But in the pure float configuration, it's possible to have double axis tracker. And just like the land-based installations, tracking the system, of course, will have an overall increase in the output of the system. And yeah, so you just have to, the choice of the tracking you're going to use will depend on the choice of the floating PV configuration.
I hope that answered the questions.
I hope so. She is muted.
Yes, the question was perfectly answered.
Oh, thank you very much. Wow, I'm sure we've come to the end of the questions because I do not see any other questions, and I cannot recall if any other person posted anyone. And I think there are no hands, so we've come to the end of the section. Wow, Mr. Tom is still here. Thank you so much, Mr. Tom, for staying till the end. Thank you, everyone, for staying to the end. I'm so delighted that you got to learn a lot. It was quite an interesting conversation going on. Thank you so much, Ms. Zita. Wow. This is really mind-blowing, and I'm so glad that we got to have this section today. Thank you, Mr. Tom, once again. Thank you, Ms.
Well,
Zita.
and I have one ask of you all. Sorry to interject, and this is just the marketer. I would love to thank all of you for joining. So I know people are funny about being on camera, being not, but I was wondering if you all would oblige me. I thought if anyone who's here feels comfortable getting on camera, I can take a screenshot and do a shout out on LinkedIn to all of you. So
Yeah.
you know, and I'll obviously you know, Zita and Shalom, I'll share the screenshot with you. But again, I know people are funny that way. I have colleagues who never want to be on camera, but if you want to, I'll give folks like a minute or two. If you want to get on camera with a big smile, I'll take a screenshot and do a shout out. So I'll give you all a minute in case someone is still waking up or doesn't have
So while
enough
you
coffee
come on
yet.
camera, I just also want to thank you. I saw the links you shared from EDP, and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
definitely going to look at the link. Thank you for sharing.
definitely. And I'll put you in touch with the head engineer. It was the largest project in Europe that was just built, and it was really cool because it's hydropower, storage, and solar all in one place, right? With one interconnection point. So yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay. So I'll give one more minute to anybody who wants to get on camera. Totally understand if people are shy. Okay. Well, with that, let me do a, let's hope technology works. I'll do a screenshot. So biggest smile you can. 1, 2, 3. Awesome. Got it. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for obliging. Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you
you so
very
much.
much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And please look to your emails. Don't forget the raffle. Don't forget to look that up and send your answer to Mr. Tom. I tell you, take it from me, we took the risks. It's amazing. You wouldn't be able to get out of the leaves of the page. Ask Zita. We kept talking about the things that we had learned from the pages of the book, and we would write you the review. Don't worry about it. We'll write
Oh,
you
and
the
reviews
review.
are welcome. So we're if on Amazon anywhere, just write a review. Thank you for that.
Yeah, we would
Again, the
definitely
worst
write you the
marketer.
review.
I'm the worst marketer for myself, but definitely write a review. But no, that's really kind of you. And everyone, thanks
Yes.
again for spending your Saturdays with us.
Yes, thank you so much.
The
Please
new
look
arts
forward to your
technology.
emails.
Oh,
We'll be
sorry.
sending the documents, the slides, and also sharing any further information. And look forward to our March edition of Renew Education. So thank you once again, everyone. Have a
Great.
nice
Thanks, everybody.
evening.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh,
Bye.
Thank you.
thank you for joining, Opemi. I just saw you. Wow. Thank you for joining.
Honestly, it's a very big educative and insightful event. Honestly, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard a
Yeah.
lot of new tech things that I haven't heard before, especially for the floating PU systems
Of
and
course,
programs
of
I
course.
never even knew EDP was already hosting. Wow.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you so
everybody.
much.
Bye.
I see Mr. Tom has dropped his email for the raffle. Please let's always get to that. I think I'll also join in. I mean, we could.
Why not? Why not? You get to listen to my voice for 9 hours, so I can't.
Wow, such dedication.
I
Wow,
think I need to
9
pay people to
hours.
listen to me for 9 hours, right? But you get 9 hours of me. Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And that it's something that someone can share as well. So
Exactly. Awesome. Well, take care, everybody. Thanks so much again.
all right.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Vi. Thank
Thank you
you,
so
Zita.
much.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Tammy, for joining. Oh my God, he's fun. Oh, thank you, everyone. I think I'll end the meeting for everyone right now. Any questions? Always. Oh, thank you, Abdubasi. Thank you for always joining. I see you all around. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Praise. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Sambo. Thank you, Bello. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Oh, yes. Please tell someone about the March edition. The posters will be going out soon. So look forward to it. All right, I'll end the meeting for all. Thank you once again. Thank you.